Okay, so our talk tonight is on the Eucharist as sacrifice. The sacrifice of the Eucharist. And it's a beautiful time to reflect on this at the conclusion of this series on the Eucharist. And as we're 2 days from Good Friday, and tomorrow night we celebrate Holy Thursday, the institution of the Eucharist and the priesthood. And so what we want to reflect on tonight is why did Jesus institute the Eucharist, and in particular, to offer a sacrifice and give that to his church. And so we're going to look at 3 questions tonight. First, why do we offer sacrifice to God? Why do we need to? Second, how is the Mass the same as what Jesus offered on Good Friday on Calvary? We're going to see it is the same, essentially. And third, how do we join in the offering? Right? So those are our 3 questions for tonight. So let's start with the first one. Why do we offer sacrifice to God? Do we need to offer sacrifice to God? I think many of us think that, well, sacrifice, that was something that the Aztecs offered. That was something that the Jews offered in the Old Testament, all of that blood poured out on the altar in the Temple of Jerusalem, animal sacrifices, and thankfully we don't have to do that anymore. And sacrifice has been left behind. And that's not right. And every Mass is a sacrifice, and is the greatest sacrifice that could ever be in any possible world. So we still offer sacrifice to God, and that's the Mass. So why do we do that? Now, philosophers speak about a virtue that I think most of us won't think of as a virtue. We spoke a little about this in the talk 6 weeks ago. There's a virtue that philosophers call the virtue of religion. And when we think of religion, I don't think any of us probably think of it as a virtue. We think of it as a system of rites and worship, prayers. But it is rightly a virtue by which we give to God his due. Right? There's the virtue of justice. Justice is to give each one their due. Right? And so if we have a contract, we have to give the due to the one we've contracted with. I have to give work to my employer, he has to give me my pay, and that's justice. But there's also a justice to God. And that's to seek to give to God his due. But there's a problem here, right? What's due to God? Everything. Because he's God. I mean, he's an infinite being who's... Can you still hear me back here? Yeah? He's an infinite being who's infinitely good. And on top of that, everything that we have, our life, our being, every single thing comes from him. And so we have a duty of praising him for who he is, and then of thanking him for what he's given. Well, what he's given is everything. And then on top of that, we've sinned against him. And so in addition to, so just by those first 2 things, we'd have to give an infinite thing back, right? Because he's infinitely good, we should give him an infinite kind of tribute. He's given everything in creation, so we should kind of give everything back, but we can't. And then on top of it, we've sinned against him. And so we should offer some kind of satisfaction. But sin has a kind of infinite dimension, because in every mortal sin, we turn away from the infinite God to prefer something else that to him, knowing that that displeases him greatly. And so that too requires that we give something back to him to make up for that, to offer some kind of satisfaction. And so to give to God his due would mean giving him something that would be worthy of him for those 3 reasons. Yeah. And so this is why in every culture, except our own, for the most part, our secular America, we always find religion, we find a priesthood, and we find sacrifices being offered to God. And that's good. There's a problem, though. The sacrifices offered aren't worthy of God. And so animal sacrifices, the first, in ancient Israel, we saw that God asked the Israelites to offer the first fruits of their harvest to God as a token that everything comes from Him and that everything should go back to Him. So He asked them to offer the first. And likewise, they offered animal sacrifices, in particular the blood, pouring out the blood for the Lord. Why the blood? Right? Because the blood represents the life, and life is God's greatest gift. And so some animals, their blood is poured out, giving it back to God to show that everything comes from Him, everything should go back to Him, and also to offer something by way of atonement for sin. And we can see that every culture recognize this need because we find sacrifices in every culture. And together with sacrifices, also a priesthood. Right? And the reason for that is because man's a social being. Right? Each one of us needs to offer something back to God, but we're not just isolated individuals. We're social beings, and so we need to offer something to Him as a society, and not just as an individual. And how do we do that? Well, that means that someone has to stand as in a place of headship and to offer on behalf of the whole community. And that's the priest. The priest is a mediator between God and mankind. Right? He stands between offering to God on behalf of the whole community and winning from God blessings for the whole community. And he stands in between. Right? Now, again, there's a problem. Priests in all the various religions of the world don't really stand between God and men. They're just men like other men. And thus they can't perfectly mediate because they're on our side and they're not on God's side. So, and it's good that the different religions of the world recognize that we needed to offer things to God and that there needs to be a priesthood to offer. But there's a problem. We can't offer Him of ourselves something that is actually due to Him. And we can't actually have a mediator of ourselves who properly mediates between God and man. And this was one of the great reasons by which God became man. Right? God becoming man can do both of those things. So God becoming man is the perfect priest by that very fact. Because the Word incarnate is a man like us and the new head of the human race. And so He could offer something from our part on behalf of all of us as our head and true man. But since He's also God, right, He stands in between and has a divine dignity as the second person of the Trinity. Right? So He's the perfect priest by being God made man. And then, again, because He's God made man, He can offer something worthy to God. What can He offer? His own self, right, which has an infinite dignity. And that's the fundamental reason He became man, so that He could offer Himself, dying for us, and giving Himself to the Father for those reasons that I mentioned before. Right? To give to God an adoration and praise worthy of God. So when we love someone, we want to give them gifts. Right? And we want to give a gift that represents the value of the person that we love. And of course, it never comes down to that, right? You give an engagement ring, a diamond. Well, what's a stone compared to my beloved? But nevertheless, you give something to represent one's love for the beloved. So what could one give to God for the fact that He's God? Well, Jesus could give something. His own divine life. And His own life as a divine, I shouldn't say that. His own life as a divine person has an infinite dignity. And likewise, He could offer that same life in thanksgiving for all the benefits that we receive from God. And He could offer that same life as a sacrifice of atonement, making satisfaction for all the sins of the world. And He could also offer that as and by way of supplication or petition for all the needs of mankind. And so those are the 4 reasons we pray to God and offer him sacrifice. To praise and adore him, to thank him, to offer satisfaction for our sins, and to ask for all our needs. Right? And Jesus, on Calvary, did precisely that. Offering his life, he gave the perfect sacrifice. Right? All the other sacrifices of human history were just figures or types pointing to that perfect sacrifice on Calvary. Right? So Jesus Christ on Calvary was the perfect high priest and offered the perfect sacrifice. Okay, now, another question. Well, if he was the perfect priest there, and he offered the perfect sacrifice, and it was an infinite sacrifice, giving a perfect, infinite thanksgiving, and making perfect satisfaction for all the sins of human history, and being sufficient gift to win for us all the blessings that we need for our life, why do we still have to offer sacrifice? Why do we need the Mass? Right? That's our second question. Right? So our first conclusion is Christ's sacrifice on Calvary was the perfect sacrifice of the perfect priest. And he offered something more positive, his life offered with unlimited, boundless charity, and for the glory of his Father and for the redemption of all human beings. So that was the perfect sacrifice. Why do we still need sacrifice? And there's a simple reason. We too need to give to God his due, right? It wasn't enough that Jesus gave to God his due. Each one of us individually has that duty to give to God his due the best we can, and to do that not only individually, but to do it also socially. Right? That's each one of our tasks. We're all from God. We owe everything to him. We love him above all things, and so we want to give him something. It's simply the logic of love, that when you love someone, you want to give them a token of your love. You want to give a sensible sign of our love. And therefore, mankind needs to give a sensible sign of our love and thanksgiving and our to make some satisfaction for sin. And it's not enough that it was done 2,000 years ago by Jesus Christ, because each one of us has to do it individually and collectively. Right? But again, there was that problem that we mentioned before. We of ourselves can't do that. And so how did Jesus solve that problem? He solved it by first founding a church in which we would be incorporated into him, become members of his body. And in that church, also instituting a priesthood, which we celebrate tomorrow. It's the anniversary of the institution of the priesthood. And he instituted the priesthood when he, at the Last Supper, after he offered the first Eucharist, he said, "Do this in memory of me." And when he said, "Do this," those who were there, the apostles, were given the mission to continue what he did on that first Eucharist, Holy Thursday. Right? So he instituted a priesthood so that that sacrifice that he offered on Calvary could be offered, that same one, every day of the church's life by the whole church in every place where the church is and where there's a priest. Right? So Jesus didn't want his church to be left without a sacrifice to offer to God. Now again, I don't think we have a good enough sense of this. I think most of us think of religion principally as receiving things from God, right? And going to Mass to receive things from God, to get things. And sure, God's God, and so he is the great giver of gifts. But imagine if our relationship with one's spouse and children. Yes, we want to give, we want to receive the love of our loved ones, But even more than receiving their love, right, we want to return that love and give it back. It's simply the logic of love is that when we have been loved, we want to return the gift. We want to complete the circle. Right? And so having been loved by God, we want to give back to Him. And Jesus wanted to give us something that we could give back to God that would truly be worthy of so good a God. And what could that be? Himself and His own sacrifice on Calvary, right? That's what so Jesus has given us the perfect gift. What's the perfect gift? The perfect gift is a gift that can be given back, as it were, with interest. In other words, the perfect gift is to give to the one that you love an ability to give back. And we see this in so many ways in our relationships with people. Just simply on the economic level. It's one thing to give a person a welfare check and to keep them from starving. That's a great thing. But it's a much better thing to give them a job, right? So that they can give back and that they can contribute to the common good of society. Right? And the same thing in our relationships with our love, with our children. We don't want to just feed them for their whole lives. We want to give them, above all, independence. We want to give them maturity. We want to bring them so that they can give back. Right? And our relationship with our spouse has to be always helping one another to love one another back, right? To return the gift. And so God wanted to do this thing with us. He wanted to give us a gift that would be a gift that we could give back to Him. And that's really the most beautiful gift that He's given us. He's given us Himself, and He's given us Himself in such a way that we can give Him back. So that we can, right, so what could we give to God that would be worthy of God? Right, there's only one answer, God. Right, God is the only, I shouldn't say thing here, God is the only good that's good enough to give back to God. And so the Father sent His Son in the world so that His Son could give Himself back to the Father for our redemption. But the Son has given us Himself so that we can join in offering the Son back to the Father. What does that mean? That means that we can offer something truly pleasing to God. We can offer God to God. God the Son, we offer to God the Father through the Holy Spirit, right? That we're invoking in the Mass to be able to do that. So that's what Jesus has given us in the Mass. And that's why, so that means that the Mass is first and foremost a giving back. And that's why it's called, what does the Eucharist mean?
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving, right? It's the Greek word for thanksgiving. Right? So how do we thank God for everything? Creation and forgiveness of sins, being elevated to the promise of heaven. So the only way to thank Him properly is to give God back to God. We give God the Son to God the Father in the Mass. He offers Himself for the Father and wants us to join in the offering and to offer ourselves in the process. All right, so that's the answer. And so that's why Jesus wanted the sacrifice of Calvary to be made present in the church, in every place, in every day. And this is why the church requires us, and some people think excessively, to be present at Mass once a week, and on holy days of obligation, Sundays and holy days of... She doesn't require us to receive communion every time, right? We're only required to receive communion once a year. Obviously, it'd be better if we receive more frequently. But we're required to be present at Mass and to participate in the sacrifice every week and Holy Day of Obligation. Right? They're two different things. One thing is, the Holy Communion is to receive God. That's pretty good. But the sacrifice of the Mass is to join in the offering of God the Son to his Father. And right, that's the reason for the Sunday Mass obligation. And I think, again, very often people think, well, this church is, I don't know, obliging too much. The statistics tell us 25% of Catholics go to Sunday Mass on the average. And that means that 3/4 think that they have something better to do than to offer God to God. Yeah. And so the Mass is fundamentally a movement like this. It's an ascending movement from the altar here on earth to the altar in heaven, to God the Father. Right? We're offering God the Son, who's made present on the altar, through the words of consecration. Right? So when the priest says, "This is my body," what was bread becomes Christ's body, and what was wine becomes Christ's blood. Christ is truly present on the altar, the same victim as was present on Calvary, the same victim that was nailed to the cross, the same blood that God poured out from his hands, his feet, and his side, his head. That same blood is made present on the altar. So we've got the same victim in every Mass as on Calvary. And we've got the same priest ultimately, right? Because the ordained priest, Monsignor or Father Hamilton, they, at ordination, are given practically an inconceivable power, a power to act in the person of Jesus Christ, head of the church, and thus to speak in his words and to realize his actions, something that only Christ can do, turn bread into himself, as well as himself he says. Right? And so, in every Mass, ultimately we have the same priest as on Calvary, Jesus Christ, who's acting through the lips of his ordained priests. And he's using their lips and their hands so that he can offer himself, the exact same victim as on Calvary, the exact same priest, and for the exact same purpose. To glorify his Father, to thank him for all the gifts of creation, and to offer a perfect sacrifice to atone for all the sins of the world from the beginning to the end. In every Mass, the victim who's offered on the altar, Jesus Christ, then all the sins of human history from the beginning to the end of history are displeasing. And so in every Mass, we have essentially the same sacrifice as on Calvary. And so Jesus found a way to do something that we obviously wouldn't have been able to figure out. How do you make this? Because his sacrifice on Calvary is essentially an historical event, right? On Calvary, he died for us, giving his life, and for the glory of the Father and for the redemption of mankind. Historical act, it's done, it was over. We weren't there. But he found a way to make that very sacrifice present in the church every single day, and to enable the whole church, wherever the church is, St. Louis, Africa, China, to offer that same sacrifice to the Father for the same purpose. To glorify him, to thank him, to offer sacrifice for sins, and to beseech him for all our needs. And so we've got the same sacrifice. Now this was, at the time of the Reformation, this was one of the most tragic things about the Protestant Reformation, is Martin Luther denied both of these things that we're talking about tonight. He denied that the Mass was a sacrifice, and he denied that Christ instituted a priesthood to offer that sacrifice. And so at the time of the Reformation, the Protestant churches lost, actually, first the priesthood, and they lost the notion of the Mass as a sacrifice offered to God. And part of the reason for this was because they weren't able to answer this objection. They thought, it says in the letter to the Hebrews, that Christ offered himself once. Right? Perfect sacrifice, and that's quite true, right? He died only once. He rose from the dead and dies no more. Right? So Christ died once, a perfect sacrifice. And so then the question Martin Luther had is, if that's so, how can the Mass be it would be another sacrifice, and why do we need any other sacrifice different from Calvary? Calvary's enough. That was the objection. And by offering Masses, Martin Luther thought we were trying to, buy our salvation or do works, good works, offering him a Mass, to win salvation from God. And Jesus already did everything for us, and so what do we need it for? That's kind of and so Martin Luther actually thought that what we're talking about tonight, thinking of the Mass as a sacrifice, was in fact the great blasphemy. The worst, the fundamental thing that the Catholic Church got wrong. And the fundamental reason not to be a Catholic. And so what should we think about this? Well, we should think it's just exactly the opposite, with all due respect. That the Mass is in fact the first reason to be a Catholic. And the fact that the Mass is a sacrifice doesn't denigrate the priesthood of Christ or the sacrifice of Christ, but it immensely glorifies it. And it just simply when something is, precisely because Christ's sacrifice on Calvary was the perfect sacrifice, we want to offer that one and not any other sacrifice, right? And the beauty of Jesus' priesthood is that he enables us here today, through the hands of his ordained priests, to offer that same sacrifice and not another one. In Israel, they offered, each family had to offer a Paschal lamb each year, right? And each year you offered a different lamb because the one you offered last year died in the process. That's how it works, right? You pour out the blood. And so you can't offer the same lamb year after year because right? And in fact, in Israel, they offered, depending on the population, every group of 10 would have to offer a Paschal lamb. And so maybe they offered in 1 year 50,000 lambs, and then the next year 50,000 more, and then the year after that, etc., etc. Why? None of them are the perfect sacrifice, so they have to be, none of them are sufficient. All right, Jesus Christ is the infinite sacrifice. He's the perfect lamb. He's the true lamb. And so we don't want to offer another sacrifice. We want to offer that same one. And Jesus enables us to offer that same one because he makes himself present, body and blood, on the altar in every Mass. So we've got the same sacrifice. We don't have a different victim, we've got the same one. And he offered himself he instituted the Mass under two species, there's bread and wine, precisely to represent his bloody immolation on Calvary. Immolation is just a fancy word for the offering of a victim, the pouring out of the blood of a sacrificial victim. And so on Calvary, Jesus' blood got poured out of his body physically, and that caused his death, among other things. Right? The separation of his blood from his body. In the Mass, the bread becomes his body, the wine becomes his blood, separate, precisely to represent sacramentally, mysteriously, what happened physically on Calvary. Right? On Calvary, there was a physical separation of his body, his blood from his body. He can't physically separate his blood from his body anymore. Why not? He's risen from the dead, right? He's got a glorious body. He dies no more. So on Easter Sunday, that blood that got scattered got all rejoined to his body on Easter Sunday. And so we can't offer a bloody sacrifice, and we wouldn't obviously want to offer a bloody sacrifice of Christ's physical death, separating his body from his blood physically, really. But Jesus instituting the Eucharist in this way, first his body, then his blood, it sacramentally represents that very death on Calvary. In reality, though, the words that make his body present, when he says, "This is my body," they directly make his body present, but the rest of him comes along too, because he dies no more. He can't actually separate his body from his blood, and he can't separate either one from his soul. So that's why it's not necessary to receive under both species. Just receiving his body, we receive all of him. Just receiving his blood, we receive all of him. But nevertheless, he wanted himself represented on the altar in the state of a victim immolated, with the blood separated from the body through this separate consecration. And so on the altar, we've got the same victim. We've got the same priest. We've got the same intention for which he offers himself. And we have a representation, as it were, of the bloody immolation, but he dies no more. And so that's the only difference between the Mass and Calvary. So I guess it's an important difference. He dies no more, but otherwise it's the same sacrifice. We've got the same victim, the same priest, the same intention of offering. It's just that he can't physically separate his blood from his body anymore. And so we do it sacramentally. But the way that the sacraments work is that what they represent, they make present, they realize. Right? And so sacramentally representing his death truly makes that sacrifice of Calvary present with all of its power and all of its effects. And he gives that to his church to offer to the Father so that we can participate, right? So that we can join in the offering. And that's something that our nature requires, that we sensibly offer something to God, worthy of God. And in the Mass, we've got something that is super abundantly worthy of God. Whereas in all the other sacrifices of mankind, it was infinitely less than what is due to God. So that's how the Mass is the same sacrifice as Calvary. And so that's how we answer the objection of Martin Luther. It's not another sacrifice, it's the same one. That doesn't detract from his priesthood, it magnifies it. Because that priesthood is so great that it continues to operate until the end of time. And it continues to operate every place and every day. That's a better priesthood than one that was exercised only on one day, and only in one place, and in which we weren't there, and which our children weren't there, etc., etc. Right? So the Mass is the glory of Christ's priesthood. And it doesn't detract from Calvary, but glorifies Calvary by enabling us to be there in essence. Right? Yes, we were born 2,000 years ago, but we offered that very body and blood. It was just offered to the Father. All right. How do we participate? Question 3. Jesus doesn't want to go back to the Father alone. Right? He wants, and this again is the logic of love. When we love somebody, we want other people to appreciate them too. Although sometimes we might be jealous, but that would be unworthy, right? So when we love, even if it's something silly like, I don't know, loving music, we want everybody else to hear it. And when we see some beautiful work of art, we want to show it to everyone. When we see a beautiful mountaintop, it's just a natural, we want others to see it too, and to glory in it. And so, Jesus wants his offering, he wants God to be loved by all, and he wants us to join in the offering. And that means that we have to do a like offering. All right, so what's Jesus' offering? Jesus was unique in this. On Calvary, he was both priest and victim. And that was unique, because every other priest, think of all the priests of Israel, they would offer other things, lambs, bulls, and barley, but they couldn't offer themselves. Even Abraham didn't offer himself, he offered Isaac, or was about to. And so no priest was both priest and victim at the same time. Jesus alone was priest and victim, offering himself. And so What should we do to add? We have to add ourselves to. And what does that mean? It means, above all, adding the sacrifices of the Christian life. And simply the sacrifice of fidelity to the Christian life. All the sacrifices of being faithful to Jesus Christ. And that's the joys as well as the difficulties, the trials, and the sufferings. Sharing, basically offering our life with, and how should we think of this? I think that in practice, the best way to think of it is at the time of the offertory, right? When the gifts, some bread and wine are offered, we should think there, I need to offer myself too, right? I need to put my life there together with those offerings. But first, that means that I have to live in such a way that I can be put there, right? And it also means that if I haven't lived in such a way that I can be put there, I need to go to confession, right? So that my life can be offerable together with Jesus's. Right? That's the Second Vatican Council put a lot of emphasis on the idea of active participation in the Mass. We're to come to Mass not to be spectators, right? Nobody's a spectator at the Mass, but we're participants in the sacrifice. And this is the glory of the church, of the baptized faithful. At baptism, we've been given a share in Christ's priesthood, all the faithful. And it's a deeper share, as it were, a mature share at confirmation. So baptism and confirmation give us a real share in Christ's priesthood. What does that mean? It means that we're able to join in the offering. And that's why the priest in the Mass at the offertory says, pray that my sacrifice and yours be acceptable. The priest offers in a different way than we offer. Right? The priest offers in the person of Christ. And that's how Christ is priest in every Mass. Right? Because he's acting through the ordained priest. But the church also offers in all her members, and we're those members. Right? And so we're also offering. We can't do it alone though, right? Because if there's no ordained priest who can say those words, this is my body, there's not going to be Jesus on the altar, there's just going to be bread. And so the priesthood of the lay faithful is totally dependent on the ordained priests, right? And that's why we're so thankful to our priests, because they alone can make present that infinite sacrifice, but we're all called to share in the offering of back. And so again, how do we do that? Putting in our own lives and realizing, maybe I should say first, the first way we participate is realizing what's happening. In other words, in order to participate in the offering of God back to God, we have to know that that's what the Mass is. Right? We have to know that the Mass is essentially the sacrifice of Calvary. And we have to know that we can join in that offering. And then also that we're called to offer our lives and the struggles of the Christian life and the joys of the Christian life together with Jesus's. And this is what was meant by that traditional phrase, offered up. And so the grandmas would tell us, offer up the trials, the difficulties. What that means is essentially in the Eucharist. We're to take our struggles and put them on the paten together with the bread that will become the body of Christ. So that they get offered together, as it were. But not only the difficulties, also the joys too can be offered up. In other words, the whole package gets offered up. Everything except sin. But the forgiveness of sin and conversion from sin is the most beautiful thing we can offer back. And so that's our participation. And that's ultimately something interior. Right? That's joining ourselves, joining our heart to that offering. And thinking of the Mass as this ascending gift. Right? The Mass is first and foremost the giving of the Son to the Father. To glorify the Father and for the forgiveness of sins. And therefore, joining in that offering is simply the most glorious thing that a human being can do. Right? There's nothing better that we could possibly do than to offer God the Son to God the Father and join our lives to that offering. Now, I'm not saying we should go to 10 Masses a day, because we have to join our lives to the offering. That means we have to live our lives and do all the things, all the parts of the Christian life, so as to put our life on the altar. Right? But we want to see the Mass as it were the focus of all the rest. Right? That time in which we can offer all the rest to the Father. And then there's going to be fruits of that offering. But we don't want to offer just for the fruits, right? But of course, if we give ourselves to God, He's going to bless us and our communities and the world. Right? And so every Mass rains down on the world countless blessings that we can't know here. Right? And we'll only know at the Last Judgment. All the graces that came onto the world through the Mass and through the participation of the faithful in the Mass. And here's the general principle. So somebody, again, Martin Luther will make an objection, or not just Martin Luther, but lots of people. If every Mass has an infinite value, why do I need to go to so many of them? Why wasn't one enough? And so, it's true, every Mass has an infinite value, Jesus Christ, right? Offered to the Father. It's the sacrifice of Calvary. But we don't offer it perfectly. And I think I can speak for everyone here. And we don't live our Christian life perfectly so that it can be joined perfectly. And so it's necessary for us that we offer it frequently. And in every Mass, even though it's an infinite offering being given, the blessings that come down on the world are immeasurable, true, but still finite. And we want more blessings. And so we want to participate frequently in the Mass. And so daily Mass is a magnificent thing if we can. Jesus wanted it to be the center of our lives and the center, if possible, certainly of every week, but also, if possible, of every day. And it shows us that it doesn't detract, right, from the offering of Calvary, but it's making that offering of Calvary the center of our lives, of our parish, our community, of all our efforts to be faithful. Right? And so in the next couple of days, tomorrow when we celebrate the institution of the Eucharist, we should, I think we'll have new reasons to be thankful for Jesus for instituting it, for instituting the priesthood, and to be thankful to His priests, right? And to pray for them, who make possible our ability to share in this offering. Questions?